Okay, picture this. You're living comfortably and happy until one day your family decides to kick you out of the house and your entire community turns their back on you. You're completely on your own until one day a foreign alien decides to offer you new opportunities that aren't necessarily that great, but at least you're not on your own anymore. The only real consequence is that in a couple hundred years, history will only remember you as a traitor. Because when you took that offer, unfortunately, you destroyed an entire empire along the way. Would you still take the offer? Maybe. Maybe not. In 1519, one woman did, and unfortunately, she destroyed an entire empire along the way. Let's talk about Malinche. In the year 1500, Malinche is born and raised in what is currently Veracruz, which is a coastal region along the Gulf of Mexico. However, during this time period, it's not Veracruz yet, and it's not Mexico yet. It's the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire is one of the largest empires that is currently existing during this time period in the Americas. It's roughly around Central America, and its capital is Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City today. Malinche grew up in a high-class lifestyle. Her father held a chief position in the Aztec Empire, which allowed for her and her family to live rather comfortably. However, in Malinche's late teens, unfortunately, her father did pass away, and to make matters worse, her mother decided to remarry and have a son. Since Malinche now has a younger half-brother, she poses a threat to him, as it would make sense Malinche would inherit everything that her family would leave behind, not her younger brother. To avoid this, Malinche's mother decides to take matters into her own hands and sells her daughter into slavery, which isn't necessarily uncommon during this time period. Parents would sell their children into slavery in the Aztec Empire for financial gain. However, her mother had different motives for selling her daughter. So now Malinche is in her late teens, early 20s, and is sold into slavery. Her entire world has been turned upside down. She's sold into a Mayan region where she actually ends up learning the Mayan language while she's sold into slavery. So at this point in her life, she now knows a new Maya language and she knows her native Aztec tongue. Roughly around the year 1520, Malinche is presented to a man named Hernan Cortez. Hernan Cortez is a Spanish conquistador from Spain with two objectives on his mind. He needs to gain new land and new gold for the Spanish Empire. When Hernan Cortez arrives onto the Aztec shores, he realizes that taking the Aztec Empire would complete both of those objectives. According to my research, Cortez is presented with a line of slave women when he arrives here in the Americas. As these women are lined up, he is offered to purchase any slaves that he sees fit. And in this lineup is Malinche, and she immediately catches his eye. It's known that Malinche was quite beautiful, and perhaps that's why Hernan Cortez purchased her amongst the other slave women. He not only purchases her as a slave, but also she becomes one of his closest confidants. He is pleased to find out that she speaks two languages, which is going to be very helpful as they make their way through the Aztec Empire. In this moment, she becomes his translator, his navigator, and so much more to him. As they're making their way through the Aztec Empire, she helps Cortez and his men along the way by even helping them alleviate certain surprise attacks that were meant to harm them on their way to the capital of Tenochtitlan. When they finally arrived at Tenochtitlan, Malinche acts as a translator between Hernan Cortez and Montezuma. The relationship between Hernan Cortez and Montezuma is rather interesting, and that is a totally separate topic for a very different video in the future. Shortly after their introduction, Cortez easily takes over the Aztec Empire, and within a matter of months, the Aztec Empire is completely fallen to the Spanish Empire. They did have help with an outside invisible ally. Smallpox does do most of the damage to the indigenous population here in the Americas, which is something that nobody could have really avoided or known that was going to happen. Not long after the fall of the Aztec Empire, Malinche and Hernan Cortez do have a son together. Whether that relationship was consensual or not consensual, we'll actually never know. Unfortunately, for La Malinche, she left no primary sources behind. She never documented anything herself, which leaves a lot of questions. Was her and Cortez's relationship a happy one? Probably not. Was her relationship consensual with Hernan Cortez? Probably not. However, we have no documentation that confirms that. This is all just my assumption and just general assumptions from many historians as well. Throughout my research, there was a lot of gaps I found in La Malinche's history, which I found rather interesting. Her and Hernan Cortez's relationship is always very strange. Again, whether or not that relationship was consensual or not does raise a few questions, but also she does end up marrying another Spanish man named Juan Murillo. Their relationship we have really not a lot of information about, other than the fact that Hernan Cortez might have orchestrated their marriage together, and unfortunately we don't really have a lot of reason or information to understand why he might have pressured them to get married, or if there was some sort of other issue that he needed them to get married as well. It's all very confusing and I don't understand it. If you know any more information about La Malinche's marriage, I would love to hear it. I'm at a dead end when it comes to that. But when she's married to her husband, they do have a daughter together, and unfortunately, like 2 years after La Malinche has her daughter, she dies of smallpox. It's believed that La Malinche doesn't even reach the age of 30, and throughout her entire 20s, she was able to help Hernan Cortez take down the Aztec Empire. She has 2 children with 2 different men and is married, and 2 years later, it dies of smallpox. So what are my final thoughts? Well, the first question that arises is La Malinche a traitor? Unfortunately, throughout history, La Malinche is labeled as a traitor, especially in Mexico. However, that sort of point of view is starting to change. For my reasoning of believing why she gets labeled as a traitor is due to the fact that she does decide to help Hernan Cortez and his men over the Aztec Empire. In that one situation where she did help them from a surprise attack, maybe she didn't have to. However, we don't know the context of that situation. I think it's also important to note that historically, it's really easy to blame a woman for any sort of flaw that happens throughout history. She is one of many women that unfortunately take a hard fall when something terribly happens throughout history, or if there's someone that's needed to blame. I think overall her legacy starts to kind of form into this Aztec woman that decided to take the side of this foreign invader over her own people. Which leads me to my next question is, do I believe that La Malinche is a traitor? And short answer is no, I don't think she's a traitor. I think La Malinche made do for what she had in the moment, especially if things started to get more complicated throughout her life. I think it's important to remember that she does suffer through a lot of trauma just researching through her story, going from a very well, comfortable lifestyle to sold into slavery, and we don't really have a lot of information of what her life was like a slave. I can assume that it was definitely not good. So I think when Hernan Cortez does purchase her, which does happen unwillingly to her, I think she did see a new opportunity that arose for her, and maybe it was better than the situation that she was dealing with prior. Hernan Cortez does refer to her a lot as a slave girl, and again, we don't really know the context of their relationship, whether or not that was a happy one or a consensual one. But he does keep her close. There are moments where he does take care of her, and there are moments where we can see that maybe there was some sort of mutual agreement or maybe a bond between the two. Whether or not, again, that was forced or not, we don't know. It also made me think of a few other situations that may have caused her to just kind of cope. I think it could be possible that maybe things like Stockholm Syndrome or just coping with the trauma that she was going through. I think it's also important to note is having a child also in the mix with a man definitely might complicate the situation. She doesn't spend a lot of time with her son, unfortunately. Her son is sent back to Spain, and she doesn't really have a relationship with that child. But I think if she was in that situation, that you do what you can do best. But I think having a child in the mix probably does sway your decisions and your emotions in different ways of protecting the best interest for your child. However, these are just my personal assumptions. I'll let you guys make your own personal assumptions. And unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of information on her, which allows for a lot of theories to arise and for a lot of different assumptions to arise as well. I think it's important to note that these are all just theories and that we're all just kind of guessing here, because she, again, didn't leave anything behind. I think this is what makes her such a interesting topic to talk about, and how her story kind of just weaves in and out throughout history. A couple hundred years ago, she gets labeled as a traitor, but in today's standards, people are rewriting her history as she's seen more as a survivor. Overall, with my conclusion, I think La Malinche's life ultimately was destroyed by, unfortunately, having a brother, or having a man kind of turn her life upside down. The priority over a man's life over a woman's life is a good example for La Malinche's life and how it dramatically affects history. And I think a question could arise for history is, what if her mother didn't sell her into slavery? Would things have taken longer for the Aztec Empire to fall? Would the Aztec Empire still fall? Probably. Smallpox is definitely a key tool in that. But would it have taken longer for Hernan Cortez to meet Montezuma? Would Montezuma and Hernan Cortez's relationship pan out a little bit differently if she wasn't involved? What would have changed if she was removed from the equation? So, circling back to the beginning of this video, would you still take that offer?